I would like to introduce Sister Rita Michelle Proctor, the Superior General of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. In religious life for more than 50 years, Sister Rita Michelle is a career educator and has taught and coached at several schools. In addition to her responsibilities with her congregation, Sister is a member of the Archdiocese of Baltimore School Board, the Archdiocesan Board of Black Catholic Ministries, and spiritual advisor for the Catholic Daughters of the Americas at St. Veronica's Catholic Church. Sister Rita will tell us a bit about the history of her order and the cause for canonization of its founder, Mother Mary Lange. Sister Rita Michelle.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I know you're behind masks, but I still need to hear you. I'm going to deviate just a little bit from my script and say how happy I am to be here, of course, but how delighted I am to recognize the sister servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary who have a close connection with us, and also the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia, who has worked with us for many, many years. So thank you, sisters, for being here this evening. Psalm 10, thank you. Put your hands together. That way you can warm them up a little bit, too. There you go. Psalm 103, verse 1 says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name." It is truly a privilege to join you on the occasion of the inaugural of Mother Mary Lange Lecture in Black Catholic History. Mother Mary Lange was a woman of deep faith in God's providential care, and a woman of phenomenal courage to be able to meet the challenges of her time. Mother Lange was born in Santiago, Cuba, came to the United States with 4 strikes against her, but that did not deter her from responding to God's call, first as teacher and then becoming a Catholic religious sister. You're probably asking yourselves, and if you're not, then I'm sure you will ask yourself, what were those 4 strikes that she had against her? She was a woman in a patriarchal society. She was an immigrant, and we know what that means today in many arenas. She was a Catholic in a majority Protestant country. She was a free woman of color in a slave-holding state. In spite of these perceived obstacles, Mary Elizabeth Lange, later to take the name Sister Mary, along with Father James Hector Nicholas Joubert, a Sulpician priest, and 3 other women of color, formed the first Catholic religious congregation for women of color in the United States of America. Sister Mary became the first Mother Superior of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, established on July 2nd, 1829 in Baltimore, Maryland. The pain of racial hatred Mother Lange and her sisters endured did not hinder them from fulfilling their religious commitment. Long before Malcolm X stated, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepared for it today," Mother Lange was aware of that, and she was motivated to educate. Long before the phrase "Black Lives Matter," Mother Lange and the Oblate Sisters understood that reality. When the color of their skin became an obstacle to others, when there was little or no food, when there was little or no money to survive, when the hierarchy of the Catholic Church gave little or no assistance to them, and even told them to disband and go do housework, they remained faithful to their commitment to God and to God's people. Today, 192 years later, the Oblate Sisters continue to minister in education, parish ministry, prison ministry, and social work. A few years ago, I heard the words that were spoken by Senator Mitch McConnell in reference to Senator Elizabeth Warren over the nomination of Attorney General. He said, she was warned, she was given an explanation, nevertheless, she persisted. I can't help but think of Mother Mary Lange. She was warned, she was given an explanation, nevertheless, she persisted. The legacy of Mother Mary Lange, 139 years after her death, is carried forth in each Oblate sister and in the lives of those who have in any way been touched by the ministries of the Oblate sisters. The process for canonization is a lengthy and very detailed process, and the reality is, to quote an Oblate sister, it will happen in God's time. However, as we all age, there is a little bit of anxiety around that statement, but we are all prayerful and hopeful that it will happen soon. The process for Mother Lange for canonization was first explored in 1990, and I know many of you probably weren't even on this earth in 1990. Father Peter was here, I'm sure. But in 2006, under the guidance of Cardinal William Keeler of Baltimore, the documentation representing the diocesan investigation was submitted, and the cause for Mother Lange was officially opened in Rome. Currently, Mother Lange is recognized as a servant of God. The Positio, which is a detailed document of her life, has been completed and approved by the Historical Committee in Rome. The Positio is currently awaiting a review by the theologians. Once it is approved by them, the Positio is sent to the bishops and cardinals that make up the Congregation of the Cause of Saints. When they approve the Positio, their recommendation is sent to the Pope, and in this case, I'm going to say Pope Francis. And if he agrees, he will confer the title of Venerable to Mary Lange. The next step in this process of canonization is a healing with no scientific justification, which will be investigated and affirmed. She will then receive the title of Blessed Mary Lange. After another investigation and affirmed healing, she will be canonized and recognized as a saint in the Catholic Church, receiving the title of Saint Mary Lange. And I know in this generation there's something called the microwave generation. So we want everything to be done quickly, but we must follow this process, and in God's own time, it will happen. In the meantime, I ask you to join us in prayer that God will raise her to the highest honors of the altar, and that through her intercession, others will come to a deeper love of God and be of greater service to all humankind. May these words travel from our lips and hearts to God's ears. Let all God's people say amen. 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 Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Rita Michelle. Now I would like to invite to the podium our distinguished speaker, Dr. Erin Rowe, who will talk about Black saints in the Americas, past and present. Erin Kathleen Rowe is an associate professor of history at the Johns Hopkins University. In addition, she has recently been appointed the Vice Dean for Undergraduate Education for the J.H.U. Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. A specialist in early modern Spain, religious culture, and the cults of the saints, Dr. Rowe has written 2 books, Saint and Nation, Santiago Teresa of Avila, and Plural Identities in Early Modern Spain, published in 2011, and Black Saints in Early Modern Global Catholicism, published in 2019. Black Saints has been awarded multiple awards, as well as numerous grants and fellowships. Dr. Rowe is currently working on several projects, including an examination of Carmelite sacred history and its incorporation of Ethiopian saints, and an analysis of anti-slavery rhetoric in the early modern church. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, everybody. Before I begin, I just want to say what a great honor it is to be standing before you and delivering this lecture. Although I have to say, I feel a little bit uneasy about having to follow Sister Rita. So I feel like maybe she should be giving the keynote. That was really beautiful. And so in any event, I really feel the weight of this responsibility in the best way of inaugurating this really important series and giving this much needed elevated profile to Sister Mary Lange. And of course, being in Johns Hopkins, I live in Baltimore. And so the history of Baltimore as a Black Catholic city is something that lives with me. But as we just heard, I'm not actually a specialist in the modern period. I'm not a specialist in U.S. history either. So the past that I'm talking about is centuries old. And so I actually spent a lot of time with reading canonization processes, but they're from people that lived 300 years ago, 400 years ago. This is the closest I've ever gotten to a canonization process in real time. And so it's kind of thrilling to see on this side of it. In any event, but I am going to, in this talk, bridge together the past and the present a little bit for us, because I want to give you the history of Black saints and the period in which they emerged, but I also want us to think with the length of that history. So we're going from, this is the picture on the cover of my book, that is Benedict of Palermo. He died in 1589. He was not canonized until the 19th century, but he is still a really important figure, and we'll get more into that, but he is also on my first slide there. That is Benedict of Palermo today at a celebration, a feast day celebration. So he is both past and present in the way that the church is and the way that all the saints are. Okay, so the political and intellectual term, Black liberation, rose out of the mid-20th century civil rights and Black power movements, but has offered an important framework for scholars of the period of the transatlantic slave trade, particularly in the U.S. The surge in demand for liberation by Black individuals and communities did not begin in the 1950s, of course. It existed from the moment the first West African person was kidnapped and enslaved by the Portuguese in the middle of the 15th century, ushering in the devastating centuries-long catastrophe of the transatlantic slave trade. Black liberation can be understood in many different ways. Public, for example, like when we talk about in the early modern context, when we talk about self-emancipation through fugitivity, which we used to refer to as running away, self-emancipation through payments or work, earning money to pay for your own emancipation, self-emancipation through appeals to the law, which is something that we see happen in the colonial Spanish Americas, and then types of liberation that we can think of as being grounded in communal or individual experience, such as the maintenance of cultural traditions, kin ties, forging families, not only resistance to white supremacy, but action, creation, intellectual activity, protests, physical self-defense, and more. Something that a scholar, Adam Bledsoe, referred to as forms of life building. And we see forms of life building grounded deeply in Catholic spirituality from the period that I study, which is when the late 15th century is when the Catholic Church first arrived into West Central Africa. So Black liberation could be not only political, legal, and social, but also theological. So let's briefly take the example of the theologian and intellectual James Cone. So Lucian Joseph explains part of Cone's Black theology in this way, quote, "On the lynching tree, Black people became united with Christ himself, as he himself also suffered, hanged, and died on the wooden cross." An important thought about Cone's anthropology established its roots in the doctrine of divine disclosure in the person and deeds of Jesus Christ. Cone constructed the incarnation of God in the historical Jesus of Nazareth as an important event in human history that legitimized Black humanity. And that's the end of the quote. But one of the things that I found so moving when I came across this article about Cone's theology was how many of those themes are deeply steeped in the period that I study. And it's always important to historians that we don't do what we call flattening history. So the 16th century and the 21st century are very dissimilar, and it's important not to to act like they're the same, basically. But we still see these profound ideas that echo throughout the centuries. And so to see so much of it in this quote from about a 20th century theologian was really powerful to me. And so in some of the themes that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the talk, you'll see how it kind of echoes the relationship between thinking about the horrific suffering of enslaved and, in this case, lynched people with this incredible, what they refer to in the early modern period, they make this explicit connection to imitatio Christi, right? The imitation of Christ through this experiencing these horrific levels of pain and suffering. In experiencing it in the spiritual state of grace and acceptance, I think, is part of it for the theologians that I study in the early modern period. So, as I was just saying, as historians, it can be problematic. We always worry a little bit about projecting too many kind of modern categories backwards, but they can be extremely useful for understanding the past in the questions that it raises and the ways it asks us to think about the Black Catholic past. We can divide these historical problems into two general categories. So one of which is the ways in which the Catholic Church did or did not wrestle with the theology of enslavement and Black spirituality. And the second is the ways in which Black Catholics themselves shaped their spiritual lives and worked to challenge the Catholic Church's white supremacy and history of enslavement. Tonight, I will walk us through these questions, both of those problems, both of those questions, in broad strokes by examining the case study of Black saints in the early modern church. But before we get to the Black saints, I need to lay some groundwork about the larger picture of what is happening, because there was no veneration of Black saints in the Latin church that wasn't tied to the experience of the transatlantic slave trade. So those two phenomena rose at the same time. So the Catholic Church starts promoting Black saints as Black saints precisely to participate in the evangelization of newly baptized and enslaved West and Central Africans. So Augustine was not viewed at that time period. They knew he was African but considered him Roman, and he was always depicted white during this period. So let's set the historical and theological stage. The legal and economic practice of slavery existed on the Mediterranean Sea from the period of antiquity through the early modern period. So sometimes those of us who were raised and educated in the United States, we are taught about the transatlantic slave trade in a very specific, or the history of slavery generally, in a very specific and kind of narrow way. And so I was really surprised myself when I discovered this kind of much bigger, longer history, even in Europe itself. So all of the regions that bordered on the Mediterranean Sea throughout that period that I just mentioned participated in a complex economy, basically, of human trafficking, although it was Italian merchants that tended to be the suppliers of enslaved people, mostly captured from Eastern Europe, and sold them into slavery in the various kind of Islamic polities of the Eastern Mediterranean. But they're all kind of involved, all the territories of the Mediterranean are involved in this kind of circulation of trafficking of people and the economic markets of slavery. There were enslaved people of varying ethnicities in Italy, Sicily, Spain, and Portugal throughout the Middle Ages. including black Africans who were trafficked through the trans-Saharan slave trade. So there was a trans-Saharan slave trade, an overland slave trade that existed from antiquity to the early modern period. It's not the one that enslaved West and Central Africans at the level of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not something we often think about. But there were black Africans in Europe in the Middle Ages. So before the early modern period, before the 15th century. And the 15th century is really the moment when we can start talking about the transatlantic slave trade. So the guiding principles, if we want to use that term, for the practice of enslaving required by both Islamic and Christian law was that no one from the same faith could be legally enslaved. Because slavery appeared in the New Testament in ambivalent ways, the lack of clear denunciation of enslavement, particularly by St. Paul, was sort of, well, we can have a theological conversation about it, but let's just say he has an ambiguous take on slavery, particularly in Corinthians. But that led, this sort of scriptural foundation led many Christian theologians of late antiquity and the Middle Ages to accept the legality of enslavement under certain conditions. St. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar, who was arguably the most important theologian in the church following Augustine, argued that enslavement was licit, but he also understood it as a legal category. The Middle Ages and early modern period were times of entrenched hierarchies of people, which nobody questioned. So everybody had their own spot in that hierarchy, and if you were high up on the hierarchy, you could treat people lower on the hierarchy in pretty abominable ways. At the same time, no one questioned those hierarchies, even at the same time that theologians, of course, are espousing the spiritual equality of all people. And that relationship between those two things was embedded in the Catholic Church and how it functioned throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, where you have this incredible social stratification and economic exploitation and other kinds of violence being perpetrated all the time. And, a church that is creating incredibly rich, dynamic, beautiful, complicated theological and spiritual practices, right? So those things seem like they're contradictory, and maybe they are contradictory, but they existed at the same time without people in the past feeling like they're contradictory. So one area where, just going back to the slave trade quickly, one of the areas where we see the largest concentrations of enslaved people in the late Middle Ages was in Spain and Portugal. And that's because in Spain and Portugal, there was ongoing conflict between Christian kingdoms and Islamic polities. And enslavement was often the consequence of warfare. So lots of people enslaved during war, right? And you can if you think about the Roman Empire, that's what you think, right? You conquer and you take everybody as slaves, right? That's part of your booty as a conqueror. So, but by the 15th century, this type of warfare had died down, and the Spanish and Portuguese began seeking new economic opportunities as the military turmoil in their kingdoms eased. Castilians, which is one of the kingdoms of Spain, and Portuguese began to explore the West African coast, particularly the Atlantic islands. So the Castilians began a slow but steady conquest of the Canary Islands, where they enslaved most of the native Guanche people. The Portuguese colonized their own Atlantic islands, the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands, Sao Tome, from where they began to conduct raids along the West African coast, using the islands as a base, seizing and enslaving those they found, as well as buying slaves from West African traders. Enslaved West and Central Africans were brought to Lisbon, and from there sold domestically or shipped to larger slaving networks along the Mediterranean, particularly in Spain, although also to a lesser extent, Italy and southern France. But as soon as the transatlantic slave trade, the numbers of enslaved people starts accelerating rapidly from 1450 to 1500. And by the time we get to 1500, really, I guess 1517-ish, we see the first West African slaves being transported to the new Spanish colonies in the Americas. So it happens very quickly. And part of that has to do with this strange legal theological moment where the church is sort of uncertain about whether the indigenous peoples of the Americas can be enslaved legally. And so scholars of slavery in Iberia have sought to estimate the numbers of enslaved Africans in the early modern period in those countries. A common estimate, they say, the numbers in Seville, which is a city in southern Spain, hovered around 10% of the population were enslaved and free people of color, with slightly higher percentages in Lisbon, Barcelona, and Valencia. So we often don't think about these spaces as being spaces where there are and were Black communities, but there were and are Black communities throughout Spain and Portugal, and have been since the 15th century at least. The heyday of the slave trade in the Spanish monarchy spanned the period in which the crowns of Spain and Portugal were unified. So between 1580 and 1640, the Spanish king became the king of Portugal. After 1640, the Portuguese broke away. The Portuguese were always the primary driver of the transatlantic slave trade during this period. The British and the French don't really get involved in large trafficking until a little bit later. So the first enslaved people that were brought to what is now the United States had been enslaved by the Portuguese, right, and then sold to British sailors. So after that point, the numbers of enslaved people being trafficked into Iberia lessened. So I'm just going to show you, here's the clicker. Let's see if I can do it. So this is a pretty well-known map. This is from a really important website called slavevoyages.org. They've done incredible work that is largely quantitative about trying to understand where people and during what years and how many people were trafficked. So they have lots of different ways of thinking about and understanding the way this map is working, but I find it's particularly powerful with my American audiences because we think so much about the United States, right? And you can see the little arrow going up to the United States is just a drop in the enormous bucket of millions and millions and millions of people who were trafficked. And the vast majority of those individuals ended up in present-day Brazil and in the Caribbean. So those patterns are very important for what we're going to be talking about. So enslavement during this period in Iberia, in Spain and Portugal, was largely domestic slavery. And what that means is there wasn't a lot of agricultural slavery. There weren't plantations in Europe the way there were in the Americas. So in the Americas, you have very quickly these large plantation economies being set up, but you also had a lot of urban slavery. And in Iberia, it's mostly urban slavery. And it just is, that's not a sort of a better slavery or a worse slavery. It's just different systems, right? Different ways that enslavement kind of manifests itself economically. But no matter where we are in this period of West and Central African slavery, we're seeing the rise of anti-Black racism, this association with the status of being enslaved with having Black skin becomes entrenched in people's minds very early on in the 16th century. We also see enslaved people being marked out in other ways on their bodies. So in a Spanish town, an enslaved person might be required to be wear chains on their wrists and ankles as they move throughout the city. They could also be branded on their faces. So there were lots of ways that enslavement was inscribed on the bodies of West and Central Africans beginning in the 1500s. So the 16th and 17th centuries witnessed few anti-slavery arguments put forward by Catholic clergy. As I mentioned before, slavery was accepted as legally permissible under certain conditions and inscribed as such in Roman, customary, canon law, and scripture. Arguments in favor of slavery themselves responded to the legal requirements of illicit enslavement. It's very complicated under what conditions, under natural law and canon law, you could be enslaved. I'm not going to go into that, but the point that I want to make is that those ideas were fairly well entrenched. So during this period, people weren't talking about is slavery right or wrong in the moral way. We know the answer to that now, obviously, but they weren't even wrestling with that as a question because they started from the position that there were forms of enslavement that were permissible, right? But those frameworks, which were ancient and medieval frameworks, didn't work with this new world of the transatlantic slavery because nobody had seen anything on this magnitude, right? If you think about the horrors of the numbers that we're talking about here and the experiences of the enslaved, there's no kind of, the canon law, natural law framework that they had put in place starts falling apart. And so there's a lot of ambivalence in the Catholic Church during this period about how they're going to think about, understand, describe, justify slavery. And that is really important because one of the things that they do almost immediately when they enslave people in the Portuguese and Spanish is they baptize them. So every enslaved person was forcibly baptized, right? Mostly in large groups. And then there were process of evangelizing. So the evangelization happened after the baptism, and there was a lot of anxiety about that in the baptisms as a sacrament and when they'd been performed properly. But in generally speaking, the church was very concerned. They were less concerned about the morality of the slave trade and more concerned about the spiritual salvation of the souls of enslaved and free people. And they spent a lot of time thinking about this and wondering about it and how to understand the relationship between their ideas about human difference, right? They're sort of the developing racist ideologies of the period with the promise of salvation and spiritual liberation and spiritual equality of all souls. So they do this in a variety of ways. But one of the things that we need to remember when we think about the history of Black Catholicism is that for the church, that is a very old history. So there are Black figures in both the Old and New Testament, right? And one of Moses' wife, and largely these figures are described as Abyssinian or Ethiopian. So one of Moses' wives, the Queen of Sheba, the Queen Candace, who shows up in the New Testament, her servant Philip, who is baptized by the Apostle Saint Philip. So there is a very powerful connection that's very old between Ethiopia in particular as being part of the scriptural Near East. So there is an awareness that Black Africa exists within the ambit of scripture and that Black Africans have a place in scriptural history, right? And we see that represented particularly, so this is something that starts in really in the 15th century, is that one of the magi who bring the kings that bring gifts to the infant Christ, one of them becomes depicted as a black king. So that starts in the 15th century. By the time we get to the 16th and 17th centuries, he's almost always, like 99% of the time, Balthazar is depicted as a black king. And these types of images that you see here would be in basically every Catholic church everywhere in Europe. You have a representation of a black Christian king. And here he kind of represents a type of universality of Christianity, the ways in which the Catholic Church was global before they used the expression global. So, and then there were so this is happening. These representations are happening at the same time as the early period of the transatlantic slave trade. They're happening for different reasons, but these images are happening at the same time. You have a slightly older medieval tradition of St. Maurice, who was a Roman soldier, and he's a really interesting figure because he starts being represented as a black African in Central Europe during the Middle Ages. But he's not always represented as black African. Sometimes he's represented as white, a little bit like Augustine. So, but particularly in Northern Europe, he is represented, those images you can see are from the early 16th century. He's represented as a knight, right? As a black knight and saint. So we have Balthazar, we have Maurice, and then we have, by the time we get to the 16th century, so Maurice is ancient, right? He was an ancient Roman. And then we have, in the 16th century, we have the first contemporary black saints, the birth of several living holy people, living saints, we call them, who become venerated as saints, even before they were saints. And one of the things that's really interesting about this, so you might all be familiar with this, but in the early modern period, people were greatly respected and venerated while they were still alive. So religious life is everywhere. You think about, for those of you who've ever visited Catholic Europe, think about how many churches and monasteries and convents there were in every space in the city. And so everything about your life was organized around the liturgical calendar, around your faith and the practice of it, right? And so people would get famous, even if they were nuns in a cloister that nobody ever saw, for their spiritual gifts, for their prayer, for their humility, for their visions. And people would start to see them as what historians call living saints. And so many of them died in what we technically refer to as the odor of sanctity. And that means when they died, they exhibited markers that we associate with sainthood. And they also smelled good, because saints don't smell bad when they're dead, and it's really important to know that. There are lots of miracle stories in which you open up the sepulcher and it smells like roses. So it is really important. No, but that's literally, I think, why they call it the odor of sanctity, because it's a sweet odor and not decay. The saints don't decay. So, we have once I started looking into Sicily in the 16th century, among the Franciscan order, there were quite a number of black men who died in the odor of sanctity. Now, none of these, I said men because they're not friars. So throughout the early modern period, people of color were not allowed to be monks, nuns, or friars. Okay, they always belonged to what we refer to as the lay orders or the tertiaries. Okay, so, but there were a number of them who died in the odor of sanctity, and two of them became really important. One of them is called Antonio de Notto, and he was important, but we're not going to talk about him. But he was enslaved his whole life. And then the other one, who's the most important of all black saints, maybe all of the black saints, is Benedict of Palermo. Sometimes today in English, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, we call him, he's referred to as Benedict the Moor. In English, the Moor is a term that gets used interchangeably with black, so it's another way of saying Benedict the Black. But in the early modern period, they never referred to him that way. The Moor is not a word that they used in Italy during this period, or in Spain and Portugal. So I always call him Benedict of Palermo, because that's what they called him. Although, in fact, since we're in Villanova, I was not going to say this, but you guys might care about this. He was born in a little town in Sicily called San Philadelphio. So they refer to him that way, San Fratello, but they translate it as San Philadelphio in the Spanish sources. So he's your Philadelphian saint. So anyway, he was born of an enslaved mother, and he grew up this very humble hermit, and he was living in the wilderness in a cave, living this life of piety and asceticism. And then during this period, the Franciscans were going through a real little reform, like they do every once in a while. And they said all the hermits have to come into the convent. So they made all of the hermits go into the convent, and he ended up in the Franciscan convent of Santa Maria in Palermo. And that's where he spent the rest of his life, ministering to the poor, working in the kitchen, gaining great fame for his piety, his prayer, the miracles that seemed to surround him. And he died in the odor of sanctity, and very quickly they started collecting testimony for his beatification, really quickly, and actually also circulating relics. And so that's something that they did when a particularly holy person died. They started, I don't know how much you guys think about relics in the early modern period, but they take little parts of their body, and people would fight over them. And sometimes in the early modern period, you had to put really holy people in an altar away from the devotees after they died. You'd have the body on the altar so that the faithful could come and for the funeral, essentially. But you had to sometimes have them behind bars, because otherwise people might really take little, like a finger or something, if they could get it. But there's stories about people like kind of like ripping their clothes off and having to put them behind. And one of them is Martin de Porres. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. But he was one of them. They get really important. People are very excited when they die, right? Because their body becomes a relic. That is their access to the divine. Their bodies, their relics are a conduit, right, of divine grace and bridging the heavens and the earth. So Benedict of Palermo dies in the odor of sanctity. He died in 1589. So canonization during this period moved very slowly. And so this is very quick by early modern standards. He dies in 1589. By the early 17th century, they're already like the King of Spain, because Sicily was part of the Spanish monarchy during this period. The King of Spain is already writing to the Pope. He's already donating money. They're already circulating his relics. They send relics from Sicily to Philip in order to promote him. They're trying to get things going, right? They're collecting these testimonies. And one of the things that's interesting that happens with Benedict is that people start venerating him as a saint, even though he was not a saint. He wasn't even a blessed. He was kind of nothing except a holy guy that people believed was a saint. And he spends the next century plus being treated exactly like any other saint, even though he had not even been beatified. The church in Rome, the church, and by church here I mean the cardinals, the Congregation of Sacred Rites that oversaw canonizations, did not know this because it was happening in the Americas and in Iberia and not in Rome. They had no idea what was going on. And they were horrified to discover that this man who had not been proclaimed a saint was being treated as a saint. But it was a little bit like the horse was already out. It was already out of the barn and they couldn't close the door anymore. And there was a lot of pressure on them in the middle of the 18th century precisely because Benedict's cult was so important to the Black Catholic communities of Iberia and the Americas. And it was the force of their devotion that ended up making his beatification happen, essentially. That's a very crude way of putting it, but you understand what I mean. That the force of that devotion led to the proclamation of the recognition of his blessed state. He's beatified in 1743. But as I said, the devotion to him, the first confraternities that were dedicated to him formed in 1610, 1611, very early. And so it's a long history. He is not the only Black saint. He's the most important because he's canonized the first. Let's see. There we go. Oh, no. Where are they? There they are. So these are the four main Black saints that I talk about in my book. I'm not really going to talk about most of them. If you have questions about them, we can, I'm happy to answer them, but let's see. How do we do this? So there. Sorry, I'm only doing it on this side. This is Saint Elsvan. This is Saint Iphigenia. They are both, for those of you who know your habits really well, they're both Carmelite saints. They are Kaust Carmelite saints, don't get confused. But they were both ancient Ethiopians. So Sabon here, Caleb, was an emperor of Ethiopia who died in the 6th century. But he was famous because he won this huge battle, this evil king in Yemen massacred Christians, and so the Emperor Elsman crossed the Red Sea and killed this king, and was very famous in the early Middle Ages for this. Then he retired to a monastery and became a saint in the Ethiopian and Greek Orthodox churches. The Latin church, the Catholic church, adopts him as a saint in the 16th century. Iphigenia here is an apocryphal saint who was baptized by the Apostle St. Matthew when he came to Ethiopia to spread the gospel. Now we have below our two Franciscan saints. Which one is, now I'm trying to remember. I'm going to look at them better. The one with the flowers here, that's Benedict of Palermo. Over here is his Sicilian brother that I said I wasn't going to talk about, who had lived a slave. That's Antonio de Notto. Antonio de Notto was also never beatified, and he just sort of vanishes after the early modern period. His cult doesn't have the same life. Of these four saints who were tremendously important in the early modern period, Iphigenia and Benedict of Palermo are the ones that still have the most vibrant cults today. So if we think about devotions to Black saints in Latin America today, those are the ones that we see. And Benedict of Palermo is the most powerful of them all, probably because he was the one who was eventually beatified and then canonized. I just want to really quickly, this is St. Sabon, and here you can see him trampling over the evil king that he vanquished. And here's his Carmelite partner, St. Iphigenia. And you can see that they are royalty because they have their crowns in these portraits at their feet. And then here, let's see, there we go. Here's another, these aren't actually next to each other on the altarpiece. I just pinned them together so you could see. This is from a church, it's an 18th century altarpiece from southern Spain in a Carmelite church. And so we have them again wearing their crowns. Now, the four saints that I just showed you, that I talked about very briefly, were all incredibly important devotions for Black Catholics. And Black Catholics venerated them intensely during this period. And so they were introduced by the church, but taken over by Black Catholics almost immediately. And it was through Black Catholicism that their cults were nurtured and expanded. And the church at the very beginning was very deliberate about this. They thought, okay, if we have a Black saint, that will help bring our newly baptized enslaved people into the fold of the Catholic Church. But once they made that introduction, the Black Catholics adopted them, did exactly what the church wanted them to do, and they became incredibly important focal points for Black Catholic spiritual life. They weren't, of course, the only focal points, but they were really important ones. And the Black populations during this period formed these, you probably have heard of confraternities, which are lay organizations of devotion. And those were really important in the early modern period. And there were confraternities that were specifically for enslaved and free people of color. And so they often had a Black saint as one of their important patrons. So the altar that I showed you with the 4 Black saints a minute ago was actually the altar of the Black confraternity of this church in Lisbon, Portugal. And that's what their altar looked like. Their confraternity was dedicated to the Our Lady of the Rosary, and then they had the 4 Black saints on their altar with them. So they're all really important. But here we are talking about this guy. Oops. I've got lots of images of Benedict of Palermo. So he is an incredible, so we have an enormous number of images, mostly sculpture, but some paintings of Benedict of Palermo. This one is in Minneapolis. It's magnificent. It's smaller than you would think it is, considering how magnificent it is. It's very rare to see him depicted with a book. But I'll show you a couple of others just so you can see the variety of ways that he's been depicted over time. Here he is in Portugal, holding flowers which are related to one of his miracles. Here he is in a painting, in another representation, actually 2 of his miracles. What he's holding in his hand is a rag that's dripping blood, and the other is, there is a miracle associated with his life where he is spiritually transported, his heart physically, spiritually leaves his body and flies to Christ. So he's often represented with his heart coming out of his body. So when we think about, and here's another altar, I've got a couple of them, a Black confraternity altar. This one is also in Portugal, and you can see our 4 Black saints. The Carmelites are on the inside, and the 2 Franciscans are on the outside. So when I first started this project, I had no idea how many sculptures and paintings I would find that were from the 17th and 18th century that are in Spanish and Portuguese churches right now. And there are dozens of them, dozens and dozens of them. And I tried to document every single one that I could find because I was astonished by the range, the longevity, the dynamism of that history of devotion to these individuals. And So that's one of the things that I was trying to do in my book, is create what we call a visual archive of these images. So they're really important to me. And I started there, and then I kind of worked my way backward to the Black confraternities and the roles that they were playing. And I'll show you this last one. I have other images to show you, but this is one of my favorites. This is a watercolor that is in the Book of the Constitutions of a Black confraternity from Brazil, from 18th century Brazil, and it was probably a watercolor painted by one of the members of color. And this is actually Antonio de Notto, so this is one of the only standalone images I have of him. But you can see it at the Oliveira Lima Library at the Catholic University in DC. It's a really fantastic image. In any event, so those are the history of those saints. Now, that's just the beginning, right? The other thing we have to think about, and that the early modern church and early modern lay Catholics thought about, was what is the spiritual meaning of these saints, right? Because every saint has spiritual lessons or spiritual meanings to impart. And one of the ways as historians that we look to find the answers to these are in what are called hagiographies. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, a hagiography is like a sacred biography. So somebody, usually a clergyman, writes a history of a saint. But it's not like a biography in a strictly chronological way, because it mostly focuses on their calling, on their divine gifts, on their miracles, on their virtues, right? So it meditates on all these things. So they tell you stories to provoke admiration, to potentially provoke imitation, although not always, because some of the saints, particularly in the early modern period, engage in types of behaviors they don't necessarily recommend that people imitate, but were viewed as being indications of great spirituality. And a lot of that it was associated with the imitatio Christi, so ways of experiencing Christ's suffering. And this was not metaphorical during this period. It involved what we call penitential practices. So things that people did to their bodies in order to kind of have some version of a spiritual replication of Christ's passion. So I have one example and this is about Martin de Porres, so I'll talk about it in a minute, but they describe his extreme penitential practices in graphic language, his hagiographers, that explicitly compares his bodily suffering to that of the martyrs. His practices included frequent use of whips, steel chains, hair shirts that created a continual torment and rivers of blood. A belt of iron bit into his flesh until it reached his bone, much like the tortures to which the early martyrs were subjected by pagan authorities. The hagiographers very often link the saints, particularly, we're talking about Black saints in this case, although that trope is very common in hagiographies. They're not the only ones who do this. A lot of people did it in the early modern period. But in any event, in the hagiographies of Black saints, these types of stories take on particular meanings for their authors and for their readers. And this is what brings us back in a way to the James Cone and the lynching. Right, this idea of the way we talk about bodily suffering as a form of martyrdom, but it's a form of suffering that happens precisely because the individual is Black, right, is singled out in a racist way as Black, is treated in a specific way because they are Black, and that is the source of their suffering, right? And the hagiographies are all very clear about this when they talk about their subjects, that is the source of their suffering. So, in one example, one hagiographer, Benedict of Palermo, talks about Benedict's reactions to somebody was being very cruel and insulting him and tormenting him, and his reaction was silence, complete silence. And the author said that Benedict his silence was, quote, in imitation of the Redeemer of the world. And Martin de Porres was also described that way, as not responding to provocation, right? But the man of God, meaning Martin de Porres, was wearing the expression of an angel on his knees, like the proto-martyr Stephen. So this idea of bringing together your suffering with you suffer in patience, right? And that is what confers grace and meaning to your suffering. But again, it is specifically in the early modern period, they talk about the relationship between enslavement and these specific kinds of suffering. So there was a Jesuit preacher in Brazil, Antonio Vieira, who explicitly used the parallel between Christ's own enslavement and the enslavement of Africans as a way of offering. So he's giving a sermon to a group of enslaved and free Black Catholics who were part of a confraternity, actually. And he tells them that while their bodies are in chains, their souls are free, and that their reward would come easily in the next life with eternal joy, because the punishments from their masters are, quote, a martyrdom. He continued, quote, because in that state in which God placed you, your vocation is similar to that of his Son, who suffered for us, leaving you the example you shall imitate. So this text reads as deeply ambivalent. On one hand, there's a normalization of slavery, and on the other, an assertion of the spiritual inclusion of all baptized souls in universal Christendom. Perhaps most significantly, however, the promotion of Black saints compelled hagiographers to highlight the spiritual equality and dignity of their souls, which at least implicitly extended to all baptized Africans, right? So during a period of intense racism, we have a turning to a highlighting, right? Imagine a black saint with a crown on his head during the period of the slave trade, right? You're on a sugar plantation in Brazil, and the level of suffering that is being directed at the enslaved is beyond anything that we could imagine. And people, and they're explicitly saying, right? Early modern writers are saying, this is okay, this is just, we have the right to do this to another human being. And they say, well, maybe this person is not actually even a human being, right? And so those writing these stories about Black saints are saying, no, absolutely, these are elevating the dignity, right, and spiritual equality of Black Catholics alongside of white. And I just want to end by talking really briefly about, so I talked about a little bit about Benedict as a person, but mostly about his cult, right, the way people venerated him. But I think one of the most important things about Black Catholics, about these Black saints, is the way that they gave inspiration to other Black Catholics. So you have people who were living Black saints throughout the early modern period, and lots of them, actually. And one of the most famous of all of these is Martin de Porres, who was born in Lima, Peru, of a white noble father and a Black mother. And he was a Dominican tertiary who is famous for his medical miracles. He worked as a healer in the hospital. And he also they started his beatification proceedings immediately upon his death. He was not beatified until the 19th century. He was not canonized until the early 20th century. So, but in the first 50 years after his death, he was a living saint to the people of Lima. He was an extraordinarily important individual. So you see him represented in one of his miracles in which he is hanging on, right, the figure of Christ. And so here is another example of a living saint who I think actually might be involved in a cause of, I can't go back. There's a delay, hold on. Sorry. Yes. And this is Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo, who died, as you see, in 1748. I think there's a cause of canonization underway for her as well. She was kidnapped and enslaved as a child in West Africa, and she was brought to Madrid, and she lived enslaved in Madrid for several decades until eventually gaining her emancipation. She was a tertiary in a Dominican convent in Salamanca. She was greatly renowned for her virtues and gifts. Now, I just want to end with one example I don't have an image of, but this also, a contemporary of Martin de Porres, was this woman who had been enslaved most of her life. Her name was Ursula of Jesus. She lived in a Franciscan convent in Lima, and she had entered the convent as the slave of one of the nuns. It was very common in the Americas for monks and nuns and friars to have enslaved people, even with them in the convent. So, and then eventually she was emancipated and she decided to live there. And that's a really amazing moment in her story where she's really struggling with that. She could leave that, she'd been imprisoned in the convent, right? And taken there against her will. And she had the option to leave and live a life as a free person. Or she could stay in the convent and take some vows and live her life as a slave, but in this case, as a slave of Christ. Right? And she thinks of it explicitly in this way, and she decided to stay. So we know about Ursula because she gave an oral account of her life that was written down, right? She couldn't write, but we have these really beautiful, amazing, complicated stories that she tells about her experience. And one of the most important things about those stories is exactly what I've mentioned a couple of times, is the way that she understood the relationship between her low status, her suffering, the level of work that she did, her labor, which is physically very painful in the convent. The nuns treated her very badly, even after, both when she was enslaved and when she was no longer enslaved. And all of that, she would have these conversations with Christ and with the saints, and she would bring to them her despair, her anger, her frustration, and they would always remind her. She actually had conversations with St. Francis, and because she was in a Franciscan convent, and St. Francis would say, "You be humble like the earth, like me." And so he was pointing out that she was living a more spiritual life than the nuns that she was surrounded with, because they were not behaving spiritually the way they should, and her level of suffering likened her to Christ, who had also been, mistreated, treated like a thief, and, tortured. And so they were very explicit. And she was having these spiritual experiences where she's hearing these messages, and they have profound significance to her. So, as I mentioned, Benedict of Palermo is still a saint that is venerated throughout the Americas and Europe. Here's this is him being in his feast day in Nicaragua. He is in a mural in Palermo, and one of the things that's really interesting about his cult in Palermo today is that it is primarily driven by newly arrived African immigrants, right? So new Black Catholic communities there. I mean, there are white Catholics in Sicily who are devoted to him, but the primary devotion is he has an incredibly vivid devotional life in the Black Catholic practice of African immigrants today in Sicily. After he was beatified and canonized in the beginning of the 19th century, in the United States, he was consistently associated with particular missions in Catholic churches aimed at Black Catholic communities. And they're very explicit about that in the 19th century sources that tell the stories of some of these churches. As I said, they always talk about him as Benedict the Moor. I did a little bit of, this is very rough and preliminary mapping of parishes dedicated to Benedict the Moor and parishes dedicated to Martin de Porres in the United States. So you see the blue, I think, blue is Benedict, and red is Martin de Porres. And so and the green is where there's both. So Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, not Baltimore, strangely, Washington, D.C., various places in Louisiana, Charlotte, North Carolina. These are really important historical sites of devotion to Benedict of Palermo. And through that, we can see the ways in which his cult maintained this incredible significance for the Black Catholic community during a period where you still have, in the beginning, enslavement, right? But even by the time, a lot of these parishes are founded at the end of the 19th century, but this is the Jim Crow era, right? So Black Catholics, as in the time of Mother Mary Lange, even though she's a little earlier than the parishes that I'm just talking about, they're segregated, right? So Black Catholics are allowed to attend Mass at these churches, but they have to sit in a separate place, right? So this is a moment where if, like the early 17th century, where Black Catholics are offered spiritual liberation, but not legal or social protection or liberation. And inside the Catholic Church, I mean, I'm not even talking about society, right? And so Black Catholics and their relationship to Black saints have always had a really powerful role to play in insisting upon and creating their own dynamic spiritual communities when they were not accepted by the larger church that they lived in. And it is that legacy of Benedict of Palermo that is still so alive in our church today in the United States. This is Benedict of Palermo in Pittsburgh. So thank you very much. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rowe. That was fascinating. Thank you. So we have a bit of time for questions, and we have a microphone here and another here if you would like to come forward and ask your question, and then you can.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in, for those of you who spend a lot of time on Reddit, it is an AMA situation, so bring me your questions.
So I can get us started.
Okay.
Okay. So was there anything that surprised you as you were conducting your research, something you just weren't expecting?
Yeah, you know, one of the things is, so you can look at, so this is what surprised me is the way, and this is the way I think about it myself, the ways in which humility and the practice of humility can be subversive in an oppressive context. So you have saints that are, so the idea in theology is, right, if you think about the scripture in the crudest way, that the lowest become the highest, right? That is an idea that is echoed throughout the New Testament. And people use that language to talk about why Black saints are greater than the other saints, right? Because they were the lowest and now they're the highest. And we see that kind of in the Black saints themselves and in their lives and the way they behave. So they are profoundly humble, but even as they're humble, they challenge. So they're never passive or quiet. Like I think about Ursula of Jesus, and she's constantly calling the nuns out, right? They mistreat her, they're mean, they are talking in the choir, they're not paying attention, they're not praying, and she's not in any way, she never stops fighting for herself, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You made the history very vibrant, and it was very easy to follow, so thank you for bringing it to life for us. I have a very basic question coming from a contemporary audience. You talked about the cult of saints and relics, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the cult of saints and differentiate it from how we might hear the word cult today. There's obviously some resonance, but we might not hear it in the way that a cult of saints you're intending historically and how that relates to relics.
Yes. Thank you. That's a really great point. So I usually, when I teach my students, I'm always very clear about that. So because it's one of those things where you get lost in your jargon. So I caught myself with hagiography, but it comes from the Latin cultus, and it just means a veneration, devotion to an individual. So when we talk about the cult of the saints, it's your devotion to a particular saint or saints. That's all it means.
Well, I have another question.
Okay.
So what prompted you to begin this work in the first place? There's usually a story around how you got involved with something.
Yes, although I don't know, historian, I don't know, sometimes I think, are historian stories, origin stories ever that interesting? But I found out about, it started with Benedict of Palermo. I found out about him in just something that I read, and I was very interested in that. I'd never heard of a Black saint before. I was born and raised in the Catholic Church and had never heard of a Black saint before. And this is, I'm an assistant professor, so I already had been studying early modern saints, because I literally specialize, I only write about saints, but I'd never heard of one, so I was really interested, and I was immediately caught with the idea of exactly what I just mentioned earlier, but this idea about the lowest becomes the highest, because I had worked on Teresa of Avila, and that's something that they talked about women saints too, because of course the church was very misogynist in the early modern period, and so it was very hard for women to become saints. And so anyway, and so I thought, well, do they talk about black saints the same way they talk about female saints? So it started with a very small question, but it got big really quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, you spoke of the idea of humility, and if I understand you, in humility, there's a lesson of really of freedom there, because it's a lesson of equality, but there's also a lesson of subjugation. So, can you be tell us a little more, where are those two voices? Where is the subjugation voice coming from, and where's the liberation voice coming from? How do they balance it? Which one's valid?
Right, and that's a great question, because you think in any kind of Catholic spiritual context, those things are always in a dynamic relationship with each other, right? So even if you think your personal liberation only happens when you are subjecting yourself to God and His will and His law, and so that I will often think about what are, I don't know the word that I'm looking for, the paradoxes of Christian theology, and I find actually them to be profoundly beautiful to meditate on, and that's one of the most powerful of those paradoxes, is the relationship between subjugation and humility, and liberation, sorry. But we see it operating in really interesting ways in the lives of black saints, because on one hand, the church is kind of saying, oh, look, Benedict is a very humble saint, so enslaved people, be humble, do what your master says, and that's what you're supposed to do, right? So there's that kind of subjugation. And then there's the idea of voluntary subjugation, right? Voluntary acceptance of suffering. And we also see people, the black saints and holy people, being very explicit about their embrace of that kind of subjugation to God's will that also leads them to, basically take orders, be peaceful, not talk back, those kinds of things. But it's very complicated when you read those texts, right? Because you know that the writers they have a very specific vision of black Catholicism that they want black laity to think about and to imitate, versus the way I think that black Catholics often heard those messages, which were profoundly liberatory. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but it's a very complicated one.
Good evening. I am going to tilt this. Kind of have two questions, and I know that I recognize that your focus is really historical, going back centuries and looking at black saints. But in your research, did you see where there was an evolution or a progression in how both black Catholics and black saints were viewed, and then to kind of bring it forward to today when we look at Venerable Augustus Talton, in his cause for sainthood? Can you share, or do you see any differences in how that is being viewed in comparison to what it's been looked at, what it's looked like in the past?
Yeah, another good and complicated question. Historians are always, we often get very, especially those of us who work on the early modern period, we get really worried by progression, because we never think anything gets better. So we really don't. We've got the darkest view of history in some ways. Yeah, I know. But I think actually for me the hope of this story was seeing the power and longevity of like black Catholic spirituality, and the ways in which the existence of black saints, I think, provided opportunities for other Black Catholics to embrace religious life and to be recognized as capable of holiness and as holy figures. So I do think that is something that happened, and the church was very interested in lots of ways in promoting that, in publicizing it, right? Because it's hard to talk about the church, right? Because there's so many different voices and different perspectives. But they really did have a vested interest in the salvation of Black Catholics. So they understood a Black saint as being a good example, I guess. And we see that maybe not in the way they intended exactly, but they become really spiritually powerful. So I think that the existence of these Black saints in the 16th century allowed for the recognition of Black holy people and Black orders, I think, and Black participation in holy orders that lasted for centuries. Because one of the things that's so important to the church is precedent. And so I think you have the precedent of Black saints. And even in the early modern period, you say, no, we have a precedent for that. We know it's possible. And that can be really powerful.
Dr. Rowe, thank you again for your talk. This is a question, I guess this is the cultic corner over here, a question about the cult of saints as well. Specifically, if there are differences sort of in the cult of saints, especially around Benedict of Palermo on either side of the Atlantic, because of the reference that you made to authority and sort of what the questions about subjugation and humility, I would imagine, like if a cult of Saint Benedict pops up in Southern America or North America, that there might be a desire to subjugate more. I wonder what the relationship of authority is on either side of because it was, as you mentioned, sort of a surprise. And if to Rome, I guess, when they've been praying to this guy for however many centuries. And if there isn't a difference in authority, just if there are differences on either side of the Atlantic in terms of the cult and how people worship, or not worship, but pray to Saint Benedict.
I think what happened in the Americas is that the Black community there was so huge in comparison to Europe. And so you can see similar trends in Spain and Portugal, but the devotion to Black saints is so huge in Latin America, past and present. And in fact, the most vibrant devotion to all these Black saints exists in Brazil. And you remember from the map I showed, the vast majority of enslaved people were trafficked to Brazil, and the slave trade there lasted the longest. And so you have now really vibrant devotions. And one of the things that is particular to some of the Black Catholic devotions to Black saints is that they have, past and present, is that they have very strong African cultural elements, right? When we're talking about music, we're talking about dance, we're talking about the way the processions happen, they are very specific. And that is a way that Black members of confraternities were able to create new devotional forms, and Black confraternities kind of allowed a certain level of autonomy and in liberation in kind of literal and spiritual terms. So things happened really differently in the Americas, largely because of that, because the Black populations were so large, and there was less, not less oversight, but that just made for different dynamics, because the church was so much more invested in how to evangelize, how to make sure that enslaved Black Catholics were living good Christian lives, I guess.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for one more. I think it's not. I think you just have to hit the button.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was really provoked by the topic of ascesis, especially with respect to bodily mortifications that are very common in medieval hagiography especially. my question or thought was maybe what these lives are teaching us is that there are times when an overemphasis of literary attention to the mortification or the performative experiences of bodily suffering in hagiography and personal accounts almost don't work unless one brings the person of Jesus Christ into the center. And that I was wondering maybe if you could speak to that, as we see, for instance, how an overemphasis on mortification when there is incredible instances of racism and exploitation just does not work. It almost falls apart. Maybe that draws us back to the whole point, which is the relationship with Christ Jesus. And then in the more contemporary, going to the question of the division in history and contemporary experiences of sainthood, this seems to figure quite prominently in liberation theology in the Latin American context, and then in the American context, where over and over you see the person of Christ coming forth. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to some of those similarities and differences that are coming up with the body.
Don't walk away. That sounded like a fantastic question, and I only heard snatches of it. I think it was the.
I can take it off. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it's like the partially the podium and then the mask. I'm so sorry.
Wavering voice. I'm very interested in historical and contemporary readings of embodiment and spirituality, and so I was basically responding to an earlier question, and then your talk provoked the thought in me that there might be a illustrative or helpful use of looking at these examples of bodily mortification, which crop up so much in the more standardized white hagiography, as being really fascinating from a literary standpoint, but perhaps also problematic if the lens is excessively focusing on the body in this type of very extreme examples of mortification. And then the fact that playing in these examples that you're mentioning, the attention seems to be redirecting quite clearly back to the reason, which is this relationship with Christ Jesus or the community, and not just these embodied experiences themselves. And this is reminding me of someone who I'm very fascinated with, who does not necessarily fall into the topic of this night's conversation, but does relate to Black liberation theology, is Oscar Romero and his constant identification with Christ Jesus and the suffering of Christ and the liberatory experiences of Christ. So I'm wondering if perhaps what's occurring as a problem in these questions, rightly so, might also be a helpful spiritual guide for us as Christians to see the point, I guess, that I'm seeing that these saints saw.
Yeah, that's a great question and set of things to think through. You know, the emphasis of what we would consider today to be fairly extreme bodily mortifications and it's not specific to Black saints. They talk about them in specific kinds of ways, I think, but the acts themselves are like, that's what you see in like every medieval and early modern hagiography. It's just filled with those stories, and it's incredibly like powerful, and it seems to like partially like spiritual practice was incredibly embodied during this period, and the relationship with suffering was really acute and really important to their Christology, I think, in a way that they had to be as much like they couldn't be martyrs in real life, so that they were sort of creating their own little martyrdoms in their cells, right? And that's kind of those kinds of behaviors are what generated miracles and visions, those kinds of things. So it's something that was a really striking characteristic of an approach to spiritual practice during that period that I don't think that we don't have access to in the same way anymore, and I'm not sure kind of when it subsides, but it isn't specific to Benedict or Martin, or it's not. I was going to say it's mostly men, but it's not. They all do it, but I don't think. Pardon? Yeah, and I'm sure people are still. I'm sure we've still got some hirsutes out there. And that matters, right? The Catholic theology of suffering matters. So I'm not trying to sort of diminish it, but these more.
Oh no, I was saying it's helpful to
Yeah.
notice that it's problematic because I think that questioning in this context and showing its relationship to oppression could be helpful. That the main focus seems to be for these people, Christ Jesus, and so in a literary scholarly context where you can look at the body and go on and on about it, it's nice to have that being problematized and redirect the attention to Jesus is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. As we conclude this evening, I'd like to thank everyone who is here with us in the room, everyone who is joining virtually for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank the President of Villanova, Father Peter Donahue, and the Vice President for Mission and Ministry, Father Kevin DiPrinzio, for their support of this event. I'd like to thank everyone in the Office of the Vice President, Father Art Piccaro, Maureen Piatti, Suzanne Wenzel, and Jared May for all of their hard work in making tonight such a wonderful event. Thank you, Sister Rita Michelle and Dr. Rowe, for being our guests this evening. We are thrilled to have had you here for our inaugural Mother Lange lecture. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to having you at the second Mother Mary Lange lecture in Black Catholic history next year. Good evening.